That oral history is something that everybody does in their everyday life, around the dinner table, on the stoop, at the barbershop, wherever people are telling stories about their pasts. They're in a way doing oral history. But, I continue, oral history in the way that I'm teaching it is really one sort of formalized version of that everyday practice of oral history. And so today I'd like to ask, what is the relationship between oral history in the everyday sense and oral history in a more formal sense? How, when, why, and to whom do people talk about their pasts? And what are the uses of this talk? People make history, of course, for all kinds of reasons. And tonight, to focus our inquiry, I'm going to look only at cases where people make history, at least in part, to promote activism. And I'll present rather formalized modes of historical production, not informal meetings or dinner table conversation, but for the most part, things that are self-consciously historical and even documentary. And so I'm wondering, by looking at these cases, what can looking at oral history as a particular kind of history telling within this broader landscape of talking about the past teach us about the sources and the deployment of the power of history to work in the world? And so in this paper, I'm going to use ethnographic fieldwork and interviews to explore these questions in a case study of one particularly historically minded intergenerational activist community, and that's squatters in New York City. So squatters occupied abandoned city-owned buildings in the 1980s and 90s and defended them for decades, using a range of tactics from barricades and booby traps to phone trees and petitions. They're now navigating a process of legalization as their buildings are converted into low-income co-ops and they become homeowners. And so this is some of the media coverage of that process. As their squatter selves recede into the past, these now former squatters have been busily documenting their own history, creating a museum, building an archive in a university library, doing oral history, and sharing their experiences with a new generation of activists. An ethnographic study of this complex landscape of historical activity allows me to study oral history practices, as I mentioned, in the context of other kinds of talk about the past. And I'll use this case to illuminate the particular power and the particular challenges of oral history as a way of talking about the past. So this paper will compare three very different contexts in which former squatters talk about the past with the aim of promoting and supporting new activist projects. The first is a series of political education lectures organized by a direct action group. The second is a walking tour of squatted buildings. And the third is an oral history project aimed towards producing a book. So I'm going to use Alessandro Portelli's oral history as genre to analyze how oral history works in the context of other genres of history telling to transmit activist memories. Portelli, who, as most of you know, is an Italian oral historian trained in literary analysis, whose very influential work on analyzing oral history narratives as both historical and literary texts has really shaped the field of oral history. And so he argues that in history telling, as opposed to storytelling, the speaker is not a member of the listener's immediate circle. So there's a process of mutual exploration that goes on there in an oral history or other kind of historical genre that doesn't happen when someone's telling a story to someone that they already know. The interviewer then becomes an especially active listener. They ask for people to explain the implicit. They ask directive questions. Again, not things that typically happen in an everyday storytelling encounter. And storytelling tends to tap existing outcropping memory, where history telling tries to reconstruct things that might not be quite so much on the surface of our consciousness. So participant listeners in a history telling encounter will prompt, tell me about the time when, or add information. The end of most history telling is a text or recording, and so all three cases that we'll look at today are basically history telling genres, but only the final, Fly's Oral History Project, is really oral history in the sense that we're used to talking about it, in that it results in a written text and a preserved document. The others are more fleeting oral performances of history telling. So in comparing and contrasting the three cases, I'm hoping to contribute to our understanding of oral history and how it works in the world. And I'd like you to please indulge me in one more brief introductory detour before delving into the cases, and talk for a moment about how this fits into anthropological scholarship. And I'd like to explain why I think it's important to do an ethnography of oral history. So anthropology, as many of you may know, has pretty much always used life history interviews as a research methodology. And anthropologists have published oral biographies of their subjects throughout the 20th century. But I'm looking at how anthropology has studied rather than used oral history. Anthropologists have also had a long interest then in oral traditions and storytelling, and with the turn towards studying industrialized society in the latter half of the 20th century, interest in the practice of history as an ethnographic object has grown. And so I'm primarily inspired in this work by two interrelated bodies of literature. The first is the Anthropology of Historical Production, building on the work of Michel Rolfe-Trio, whose book, Silencing the Past, is a work of trying to understand how history works by examining the process of the production of specific historical narratives, starting with the production of sources. He also asks us to look at studies where history is produced outside of the academy, so acknowledging that school teachers, PBS producers, local historical societies all produce history in the same way that historians do. And an ethnography of oral history is clearly an important way to do this. Trio asserts, perhaps most importantly, that power is constitutive of the story of history, meaning that power is not something that's sort of outside of the process of making history, but that it's infused into every step of the process. And so I find that useful in analyzing the cases that I'm looking at today. I'm also, and this is the last bit of introductory talk, interested in the anthropology of archives and building off of that work. So this it's sort of a trend of reading archives ethnographically and looking at archiving as a process rather than archives as just things or collections of documents. And that's primarily known through the work of Ann Stoller. And then her students have moved on to an ethnography of archival production and documentation. Penelope Papelius on the right here is one of those students who's really inspired me with her work, looking at different ways that history is produced in Greek society in the last 20 years and how power works in those contexts. So I'm doing an ethnography of oral history in the context of a complicated landscape of historical production to illuminate how history works in our world by looking at specific sources, the oral histories and the oral narratives, and how they're produced and circulated. So on to our cases. The first is the political education meeting of a direct action group. So the group is 040, Organizing for Occupation. And it's a group that was created in part by former squatters in New York City, with the goal initially of building infrastructure to support the development of the squatting movement in response to the 2008 housing crisis. So people saw that in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was a housing crisis in New York City, a lot of abandonment, and the squatting movement seemed to kind of arise almost organically in response to that moment. But in 2008, when there was also this crisis of foreclosure and abandonment, that didn't seem to be happening. And so this group formed to try to build the infrastructure that was already there in the 70s and 80s as they saw it, to make that happen again today. They now describe themselves as a group of New York City activists from diverse backgrounds that have come together to fight for the human right to housing through direct action. And so that includes squatting, and they're actively engaged in squatting buildings in Queens and Brooklyn right now. And also things like shutting down foreclosure auctions, but civil disobedience and singing. So the meeting that I'm going to talk about is part of a series of political education meetings that they held over this past summer. It happened on a very, very hot July evening at the height of, I think, New York City's 4th heat wave at that point at the Catholic Worker on the Lower East Side. So there was Brenda Stokely, who was the speaker for the evening, in the center of a long conference table, and sort of concentric circles of people coming out from that table and really filling the entire room. There's a couple of fans stirring around at the edges of this massive hot bodies and air, but a very, very intense atmosphere. And people listened carefully for a long time to her stories. So as at other 040 meetings I've attended, the group was strikingly diverse. There were new babies and grandmas, people of color and white people, the hip and the earnest, the organizers and the organized, religious folks and anarchists. More than any other activist context I've ever been in, a group of people that looked like you just took 3 random subway cars full of people and put them in a meeting together. And so Brenda Stokely, the speaker, came from the 1980s anti-eviction and homesteading campaigns in Harlem. And this is one of the documents that she brought along with her to share that history. And she started off by asking the group questions rather than them asking her questions. So she asked who in this room is actively engaged in the struggle for housing, and who is personally engaged in the struggle for their own home. And so she asked one person who was personally engaged in the struggle for their own home to tell their story, which was very emotional. She started to cry. There were calls from the people in the room of support and encouragement to her in telling that story. And so she started this off by building a connection with the audience to facilitate telling her own story and to make that connection between the past and the present. Her lesson to the new generation was that organizing only works when it builds on the local leadership. People don't need to be politicized. They don't need to be convinced that their experience is political. They don't need to have leadership. The role of the organizer is just to find out what the organic, pre-existing leadership is in the community and support them in doing the political work that they already know and imagine. And the audience talked back to this point. They did not simply accept this lesson from the past. Many of the activists in the room seem to have had experiences in which it seemed like people did not think of their experiences as political. In the 2008 foreclosure crisis, many people experiencing foreclosure seemed to feel like it was their own personal problem, not something systemic, something that they should be ashamed of rather than up in arms about. And so she repeated her lesson in the face of this sort of seemingly conflicting evidence that if people felt like people whose homes were being foreclosed didn't see their experiences as political, it was because they didn't understand those communities deeply enough. And so this raises the question of how knowledge generated in one context, in Harlem in the 1980s, translates into another, Jamaica, Queens in 2008. The storyteller, here Brenda Stokely, tried to draw parallels between her time and theirs, but they challenged that. And so this is a mode of history telling in which there's a sort of active dialogue between people who are engaged in what seem to be similar processes in the past and the present. The second case is the Museum of Reclaimed Urban Space, MORUS, as they're called. It's another group that was started by former squatters and community gardeners. There might be some more chairs out in the... No, you okay? You're welcome to come and sit anyway. So it's started by former squatters and community gardeners and grew from the insight, mainly from a group of cycling activists, that after decades of direct action, a lot of it through critical mass bike rides, the landscape for cycling had completely changed in New York City. There were hundreds of miles of new bike paths, more and more people riding bikes, about to be a new city-sponsored bike sharing program. But when these big changes happened over the past 5 or so years, it seemed to most people like the government had just handed over these bike lanes. That they had just decided, oh, people need bike lanes, and built them. And the history of direct action and struggle that activists see as leading up to these changes was erased. And so they decided that activists need to produce their own history, and they need to do it in powerful ways, through things like archives and museums. Not just by telling it to other people that they meet, not just by talking about it in meetings, but by using these kinds of powerful institutional structures to spread it around. And so this museum is a materialization of that idea. The physical space, and this is just a corner of it while it was under construction, is in a legalizing squat on Avenue C, C squat, and so this is them making a sign for it out of mosaic. The physical space is mainly home base for the tours. It's small, it has some photographs and exhibits, but the real activity of the museum is taking people out into the neighborhood and talking about the history. As the tours are being led, the spaces of squats are starting to be hidden in plain sight. So whereas in the past a squatted building might have looked quite different from other buildings on the block, after the renovation process they started to blend in a little bit more. And so this is Serenity on 9th Street after an almost complete renovation. And you can see, there's some little bits of, an unusual light shade here, some handmade railing here, but it basically looks like a pretty normal apartment building. And this is Umbrella House, also on Avenue C, where you can see some bits of an old storefront mural left behind, but the two stores that are there in the storefronts now are pretty normal everyday shops on the Lower East Side. And so the tour functions first to take people to the sidewalk in front of these spaces and show them for what they are, make that history visible in a way that it might not otherwise be. And so you then enter the building, and this is Matt Metzger, who lived in Umbrella House, about to take the tour guide in. And you can see they've got their mosaic preserved under a little bit of plastic or glass there in the front. And this is the entryway to Bullet Space, which is on 3rd Street, and you can see there's some lovely mosaics there, and a police barricade built into the door frame, which is sort of typical squatter architecture. And so not only do you see the outside of these buildings, but as you can see in these pictures, you start to enter into the inside. And you go actually into squatters' apartments where they talk about their experiences. And so this is a pastrami, having a group of people into his space. This is Rolando Politi talking about his past in his apartment. And you can see there's a lot of the tour goers are taking pictures, taking video, and producing their own documentation while they're part of this tour. And so when you go into a home on one of these tours, you might be asked to take off your shoes or go in shifts so as not to disturb the resident cats. You might get a tour of the space and a narrative of the construction. This is Bill, one of the organizers of the museum, showing off his space-age apartment and his amazing kitchen cabinetry that disguises all of his appliances. Or you might be told rousing stories about the fight to defend the building. Some residents are experienced speakers or amateur historians, and this is Maggie Wrigley talking about an archaeological dig that her building did in their backyard. And others are unsure of what to say and seem to need a lot of coaxing from the tour guides. And so the tour guide really functions in a way as an editor of a collected volume of oral histories in these tours. I'd like to play you a little clip of Frank Morales, who's one of the early tour guides, talking about why they think it's important to give these tours.
Today, we're going to visit 3 or 4 squat buildings, and you're very fortunate because you're going to be able to go inside and meet some of the people who live there and look at the spaces and so forth. And that is something that we've just really begun to do. Part of the reason being is that, well, I guess broadly speaking, to humanize the situation of people who are involved in squats, to make it more real for people. As you know, squatting, maybe you're unaware of this, but squatting is often demonized in the press, and so forth.
So the message here is really from activists to a general audience. And the message is, look what we did, you can do it too. Because we're normal people, not just like you. We're humanized through your experience of seeing us talk and entering into our apartments. And I'd like to play you a little clip that illustrates that. Here's Frank inside a space that's under construction. And what I'd like to note is that he talks to the tour goers as you, bringing them into the project of squatting by the way he's speaking.
You do it collectively. So the question is, well, where do you get the funds to do this? Well, you know, if 10 of you took a building tomorrow, you'd be just like, okay, what do we have, right? You do benefits. You go to lumber yards and ask for their damaged materials.
And so he brings the audience into the community of squatters. If 10 of you took a building, what would you do? Creating a space in which people can imagine themselves as activists. So as I said, the tour is really experienced almost as a chorus of orchestrated voices framed by the tour organizers. It also can be seen as being like an edited volume where the tour guides are the editors. It reminds me of public interviews in which people give their history not just to an interviewer but to an audience that's engaged, sort of like what was happening with Brenda Stokely. So I'd like to play you an example of how the tour guides do this work of curating and contextualizing for tour goers. So this is Jerry the Peddler, a resident at C Squat, who's a very enthusiastic historian of his own, talking about his experiences. And you'll hear just him sort of tailing off at the end of the story, a little bit of mic noise, and then you'll hear Matt jumping in to give it some context. And Matt's the tour guide here.
Jerry opened up some of the earlier squats here. He lived on 9th Street right across from his park. Coming off the pocket against racism for 85.
Right, but well, 84. And we call it the Rock Against Reagan tour. We did.
And so Jerry's telling his stories, and Matt is doing the work of bringing them together into a coherent whole. Jerry started some of the earliest buildings in this neighborhood. It was at this time in the context of the Reagan era. And so while this can appear to be sort of people speaking and telling their own stories, it's actually curated and managed in really complicated ways by the tour guides and the tour organizers. So people are presented here both as living history and as people who have ongoing lives. Their stories are extraordinary, their apartments are fascinating, but also you can be just like them. And so the idea is to inspire new activists, and it's unclear at this point, I think, if it works. Initial evaluations of the tours seem to show that people are intrigued, they're inspired, but there's no evidence that they're actually inspired to act. And I think that's partially because that's an extremely lofty goal, right? Most people, it takes a huge amount to get people to become engaged in an activist project. But I think that setting that as a goal is something that's worthy and something that this museum takes pretty seriously. So the third case that I want to talk about is more of the oral history case. And so it centers around a woman named Fly, and here she is with her archives. She's a longtime squatter, artist, musician, and writer who has massive personal archives that are highly organized, and I've worked with her on doing this, although she had them pretty organized already, and are now seeking an institutional home actually through Brooklyn, which is an artist book collective that in part provides the service to artists of helping them sell or donate their archives to institutions. So this is her working with one of the people at Brooklyn to get the archive into shape for that process. Here's another piece of her archive. So she's created a squatter museum, actually previous to the Morris Museum that I talked about, in several iterations. And in this work, and as part of her work as an artist, she's really playing with the tropes of anthropology, of studying and being studied, of explaining and being misunderstood. So I'd like to play a clip for you of her talking about how she thinks about this process. And this is a photograph from a museum exhibit that, an art gallery, I guess you would call it more, that was in Bullitt's Space at the time of their legalization from a show called The Perfect Crime, celebrating 25 years of illegality and getting away with it and becoming homeowners. So this is a piece of plywood with trowels with roofing tar on it that they hung on the wall as a piece of art. And here's why.
I was really interested in presenting it as kind of an anthropological study. And so I made little tags for all the objects, kind of like describing them in this way that you would describe like ancient artifacts. And these people would, for my crusty shorts, I would I had a little card that described how these people would sew their patches on with dental floss, because what happens with the dental floss is that there's wax on it, and when you wear the clothes and they're warm because you've got your body heat, and so it kind of uses the patches to your fabric in a very crusty way that crustaceous way that makes it more permanent, and you'll be warmer somehow with all that wax. So it was kind of like studying some ancient people, because a lot of ways that we were living were kind of like ancient. We had wood burning stoves, we had crazy setups for plumbing and lack thereof plumbing, and peeing in buckets and having the squatter sink set up.
So for those of you who might not know, her explanation of why you would sew patches on with dental floss is completely fictitious. It's a purposeful misunderstanding of squatter practices, and so she's playing with that in her museum exhibit in a way that I think is really clever and interesting. One of her other documentary projects that I want to draw attention to before we talk about her oral history is called Peeps, and here's an example of one of them. And here's her in the process of doing one. This is with Stanley Cohen, who's the most prominent lawyer for the squatters, and she and I actually did this interview together. You can see she's videotaping it twice, audio taping it, And it's an intensive process of documentation in which she records an oral history with someone and draws them while they're talking. And then afterwards, they dictate words to her that sort of summarize or tell a part of their story, and she writes them in the background of the drawing while they're talking to her. And so it's an interesting sort of hybrid genre between orality and writing, because you have to talk as if you're dictating, and you talk then in a way that's a little bit more like writing than if you were just talking normally. And so people talk very differently in the oral history interviews than they do in the PEEPS sessions. So this is a really large and long-term project she's engaged in. There's, I would say, probably several hundred of these done. There's a published book, and mostly it's a collection of zines and public exhibitions that she does. And so the PEEPS are just the people that she meets in her everyday life, traveling around. A lot of them are squatters, but a lot of them aren't. And Stanley here is an ally to squatters. So why does Fly do all this documentary work? Let's let her explain it.
Yeah, well, the whole concept for a squatter museum and squatter history, I kind of had that idea even way back in the day, because I was always documenting, and I always I'm kind of naturally a documentarian. I always have been, probably because I moved around so much when I was growing up, and so I always wanted evidence of my existence. Because I'd be in a new place and be like, am I really here? And also just the idea of legitimacy. This is a legitimate life that I'm leading. I want to prove it.
And so the next phase of this process of legitimization is a book called Unreal Estate that she's working on. It's something that she started, but that's being developed and created by a collective, and I'm part of that collective. The collective is called URELIC, which stands for the Unreal Estate Living Improvements Committee, but really the point is that if you're in this collective, you yourself are a relic, just by being in the phase of life where you document your history. And so the book is going to include oral histories, but also essays, art and artifacts, and the section everyone's most excited about is called Unsubstantiated Wingnut Gossip, where people will be able to give unattributed stories about their friends and neighbors and histories in the section. That's going to be a really amazing free for all, I think. And so the interviews are audio and video recorded, they're transcribed, and they take the form of abbreviated life histories. Starting off with how did you get to the Lower East Side, rather than where and when were you born, and tell me a little bit about your childhood. But they do share an interest in biography. And so Fly's really using the tropes of positivist history in putting this book together. She wants to know in the interviews who, when, where. There's a timeline that's sort of the central product of the process right now. There's a pervasive interest in who opened all of the buildings, and that sort of trickles down into contemporary conflicts over use and property, but something that she's very interested in documenting the history too. And I think that this is in part because one major goal of the project is legitimation. And so she wants to make a history that feels like a history. It doesn't just feel like people sort of chatting and casually telling stories. And in these interviews, Fly knows most of the stories that she's recording. So Portelli said that in history telling, the speaker is usually not a member of the listener's immediate circle. But in this case, this is generally not the case. Often they're friends, and the interviews alternate between sounding like history telling and really sounding like storytelling. There's times when Fly is really mining his memory, trying to get the facts, and other times when they're storytelling, sort of exploring the outcropping of memory, as he said. So I want to play you a little clip that illustrates this. This is an old picture from the time that they're talking about of Fly and Arrow. And so this is an interview Fly's doing with Arrow. You can see that in this section, the two of them are talking about the same amount. And this is about a sort of important episode in the history of the conflict over squatting in this neighborhood, where squatters disrupted and took over a community board meeting at which some of the buildings were going to be transferred to a developer.
That was one of my sort of defining moments of my time here.
That was the summer of 1993.
Yeah. Yeah, and like I said, that was one of the defining moments of my time here, because I was sort of like, felt like I was the one who sort of like we had the plan to shut it down, but when it came to be that moment, it's like everybody was like frozen up, and like you didn't know who was going to go or what's going to happen, or there was all these cops, and there was all, and I was the one who jumped up and was like, no, we're not going to shut this down. We're going to, or you're not going to vote. We're going to shut this down, blah blah blah, and like people followed. But I got singled out. I got beat the shit out of that.
You did get singled out. I was there. I witnessed the whole thing.
Yeah, and
you
so
did. I mean, you were the one who stood up and just said, like, I mean, there was silence. It was like a picture drop.
yeah.
Because there were, like,
Even though there was like 500 people in the room, right?
I mean, it was such a shock though, because there were so many more people to speak.
Right,
You know? And
right.
all of a sudden, the guy stands up and says,
The public
okay,
speaking
we're
time is
shutting
over
down
now.
public speaking time. And everybody was just,
Right.
because the thing was that
Right, and I said,
remember-
no, we're not shutting this
Yeah.
down. We're still going to speak, motherfucker. And
That
we
was
started
brilliant.
up.
But I remember Frank Morales was like the next one in line or something. And
Right.
everybody was like, yeah, Frank. And then when they said
They're
shut
like-
it down, everyone's like, what? I couldn't believe it.
Right.
And then, yeah, so then you jumped up. And
But
then,
so-
like, after you jumped up, I remember all hell
Broke loose.
It
The
was
smoke
like-
bombs, the
smoke
fire
bombs,
alarms
stink
got
bombs,
pulled.
Like, lights went off.
Yeah,
Cops were
yeah.
swinging. I just remember standing
We all
like,
locked
standing
arms. I had like that big Sean on one side of me, I think, and she somebody on the other side.
So these interviews that bring old friends together to reminisce about their past, in part, seem to function in one way to preserve the community that shares these memories, while physically their ties are weakening. So a lot of people have moved out of the buildings. Over time, people travel and they don't all live together anymore. And when they do, they're not actively engaged in a physical struggle for their homes. And so they don't have to work together as much anymore. This community, even while it's rooted in place, is in some ways dissipating. And so the interviews bring them back together. And I want to just play you one second to last clip of Fly interviewing another person named Art Cabrera. And they're talking sort of towards the end of his interview about how they feel they're seen by the outside world. And this is actually a pair of crusty shorts. You can see the dental floss, and they're not keeping anybody warm.
Most people were glad we were doing what we were doing, but they weren't about to move into an abandoned building. I mean, when you think about it, if you can, like, be objectified and think about it, it's just this, like, kind of like this irrational. I guess it's one of the kindest words I can use. But unless you live in an organic living movement community, which the Lower East Side with all its squatting community was, with all its insanity, you really couldn't. I can't put words on it.
Yeah, I mean, if I've ever tried to explain my life to people who haven't experienced life in the Lower East Side, they either think I'm completely nuts, which I guess I am, and that's how I survived here. And they just don't get it, and they don't understand, and they think I just moved into an apartment.
Yeah.
And they say things like, "Oh yeah, I love New York City."
No. You spent 5 years.
I don't even, a lot of people I just don't even bother trying to explain.
No.
Because they, a lot of times when I get the look of fear in people's eyes when they fully understand what I'm talking about. They think I'm this like insane wingnut.
Yeah, what are you talking?
Insane political wingnut, and they get really nervous, like I'm gonna like knock them down and steal all their stuff.
Yeah. Like I want their apartment. I don't want your apartment. I just want a place to live.
So we're almost.
Yeah.
And so you can hear how both of them, feeling like the world doesn't understand them, can come together in this interview and talk very frankly to each other about that experience. And so the last point I want to make about the Unreal Estate Oral History Project is that recording the interviews makes a huge difference. The audio, then the audience can spread through these recordings beyond the people who are there to physically listen to it. And so in this final clip, we can hear Fly talking about who she thinks this book is for.
I think it's going to be a lot of younger people. I think it's going to be a lot of like students of sociology and urban planning, and I think the punk kids are going to like it, anyone who's any kind of housing activist, I think, and anyone who's interested in New York history also. Maybe one day it'll be a textbook.
So we can see how, to conclude, oral history, as seen in Fly's project, marshals this authority and this power of writing, recording, and archiving of capital H history for activist memories. It legitimates them in a way. It makes squatting into a legitimate project by writing its history. And it brings these very intimate conversations between squatters into the public eye through the process of recording. Unlike the other public history telling modes in which squatters are speaking more directly to a public of people who are not actively engaged in this kind of activity, these are conversations between squatters, as I said. So this transposed intimacy, I think, is a real strength of the process. It shows, rather than telling, the experience of being part of the community of squatters. And so I think any of us who've ever been involved in exciting and compelling activist movements can remember that it was that experience of being part of a community, of being engaged in something dynamic with momentum, of having that kind of intimacy that is often just as compelling as the political goals. That we can all see that there are reasons and things we want to change in the world, but the thing that actually makes people step up and do that is often a connection to friends. So even the intimacy of entering someone's home is not the same as the intimacy of listening in on a conversation between old friends. Reading the unsubstantiated wingnut gossip is like eavesdropping on the most private of private conversations in which people don't even want their names used. But in these cases, oral history's weakness is that it lacks the capacity for dialogue and challenge in the way that these live conversations do. Because of the level of mediation, the kinds of conversations that happen between Stokely and the 040 activists, or between tour-goers and squatters, doesn't happen. And the kinds of really intense, scrutinizing, detail-oriented, how do you actually do community organizing conversations that Stokely and the 040 activists are having, are of interest to people who are already actively engaged in these kind of processes. And there's something that happens live in a way that is difficult with the mediation of recording. So I'm going to end there, and thank you for coming and listening, and open it up for questions.